This paper is not only wild, it's also very well done. Did you know that CBD has 56 different targets that it binds to in the human body and brain? That's just wild. Most things bind to one or two places. This is why CBD is called a Swiss Army knife by medical researchers. And so I'm going to go over some of those binding sites today and why they're important. But I also want to say, this is the one paper to send to people. If you have a friend or a relative who's only going to read one paper, send them this one. It has great charts and figures to make this more easy to understand than usual, and also to list a lot of the clinical research that's been done as well. It's a very convincing paper and decently understandable for a lay audience. So, on to CBD. Of course, the most well-known receptors related to this are the CB1 receptor and the CB2 receptors. The CB1 is the most widespread receptor of its type in the human brain. The CB2 receptor is on pretty much every organ in the body and somehow relates to the immune system. And so, these are very important receptors, and CB1 and CB2 don't get bound in the traditional sense by CBD. What CBD does is something called allosteric modulation, which is the presence of CBD. It attaches to a side pocket of the receptor and changes its shape so the other things bind there in a different way. For instance, if you have CBD present, it's going to change the shape of your CB1 receptor and make the THC bind there not quite as strongly. This is why CBD helps prevent people from getting very, very anxiously high from THC. So the effects of CBD upon these two receptors are profound and really important, but that's just the start of the story. CBD also binds to some of the opioid receptors, and so of course it does all this good work for pain killing. There's an explanation right there. It also binds to one of the GABA receptors, GABA A. This is something that the benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax bind to. And so this is where probably some of its anti-anxiety effects are coming from, as well as its anti-epileptic and neuroprotective effects. It also binds to the serotonin receptors. You know, the serotonin is usually known as your neurotransmitter of happiness. The CBD binds there, and so it probably helps with its anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects, as well as its anti-nausea effects, because yes, you have a lot of serotonin in your brain. You also have a ton of serotonin in your gut. They actually don't talk. That serotonin doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier. But the serotonin here in your gut seems to be very important for your mood in general because of that vagus nerve that transmits your gut sensations up into your brain and changes a lot of what's going on. So the ability of CBD to bind to serotonin in the gut might underlie not only its anti-nausea effects, but also its effects on mood. And then one of my favorite is it also binds to some of the PPAR nuclear receptors. And so, of course, you have your regular cell. Then the nucleus of the cell is the control center where the DNA is. The nuclear receptors like PPAR turn on and off different genes. So basically, if the cell is a city, the nuclear receptors are the managers and bureaucrats at City Hall who are telling the cell to build this, don't build that, raise this up, lower this. It's a very high level control system for the cell. And so I remember one study where CBD turned off over 50 genes and turned on over 75. And it just speaks to how much CBD can do and how hard it is to study. Because if CBD is making 50 new molecules appear in the cell, how exactly do you know which pathway those are using to do the good? All you know is you can measure the good and it's there. So the nuclear receptors are fascinating. And I mentioned the G protein coupled receptors. There's also a bunch that are known as orphaned receptors that CBD is known to bind to. GPR 3, 6, 12, 18, 55, and 119. And the reason these are so important is most of these receptors you hear about in regular news are G protein coupled receptors. These are the most complex type of receptors in the human brain. And indeed, I think there's been about 6 Nobel Prizes awarded for figuring out various parts of how the G protein coupled receptors get a message and then pass on their message. They're very complex, very important. And there are a number of them that we know they're there in the cell. We don't know what's binding to them. They must exist because they're there. The nature wouldn't be building these expensive receptors if there wasn't a reason for it, but we don't know what the native ligand, the native molecule is to bind those receptors. But we do know that CBD is something from outside that does bind them. So these seem to be part of perhaps the endocannabinoid system. And there's a guess that perhaps something like GPR55 may one day be known as CB3. But it takes a long time for scientists to really confirm and change the name of a receptor like that. Another receptor type is the vanilloid receptors, the TRPV receptors, and these are fascinating because anandamide, the first known endocannabinoid, it could also be known as an endovanilloid because it interacts so closely with this vanilloid system. And so we first learned about the vanilloid system because it helps to transmit spicy signals like capsaicin from red hot peppers. But it's also involved in pain control. And so these TRPV receptors are involved in pain killing, neuroprotection, and anti-inflammatory effects as well. So it makes sense that the endocannabinoid anandamide binds to them, as well as the CBD from outside the body binds to them as well. Another fascinating one is the alpha-7 nicotinic receptor. That is an acetylcholine receptor. Acetylcholine is the very fast neurotransmitter for your neuromuscular joints. So a lot of like your quick reactions depend on acetylcholine. That's also what nicotine would be working on. Nicotine is actually very protective of Parkinson's disease and things like that. So anyway, CBD at this alpha-7 nicotinic receptor seems to be doing anti-inflammatory effects. Same thing for the nuclear factor kappa light chain enhancer of activated B cells, known as NFKB. These are not cells you see in the news every day, but it's one I often see in the literature as the reason for the anti-inflammatory effects of CBD. As I said, it can be really hard to figure out the pathway that CBD is using out of all these options, but the NFKB cells are ones that they are often using. There's also the adenosine receptors, 1, 2, and 3. There are calcium channels, and the calcium channels seem to be helpful with neuroprotective effects as well. Calcium is one of the things that a cell uses, especially in the brain, to balance out its electrical systems. And so, our neurons are always firing. It uses calcium and it's the electrical charges of calcium to balance how much electricity is there. There is also the glycine receptors. There is the sodium potassium channels. Those seem to be part where the anti-epileptic effect might be happening. These also help with neuropathic pain killing and anti-inflammation. Plus, the last thing I'll go over is 8 enzymes spread across the brain and the liver that are related to the endocannabinoid system, such as the FAAH enzyme, FAAH, fatty amide acid hydrolase. It breaks up things like anandamide, and CBD helps to lower the activity of that FAAH enzyme, which means you're going to have more anandamide, more of your neurotransmitter of balance. And then it works with a number of other enzymes and either makes them more strong or less strong, and that's changing how other drugs are getting metabolized in the body. So one more place where CBD is doing a high level change of what's going on. So the reason there's so much clinical data for CBD is because there's so many biomechanical, biochemical effects going on. And so all this great stuff you're reading about CBD, it's backed up when you zoom in and view the cell as a city, which is the basic premise of my endocannabinoid graphic novels that I'm still working on, that you can see at lexpelger.com. And so if you want to learn more about using CBD, reach out to me. I have a lot of information on whitewhalecreations.com. And this stuff can just be so helpful, especially when people are dealing with serious illnesses of inflammation or brain disorders, or for people over 50 in general. That's what led me into this, was my grandmother's Parkinson's disease. I wish I had known more at the time. And there's so much health to be gained here with very, very little risk. CBD is amazingly safe for the body in general. Not to say it always agrees with everyone, but if you stop taking it, the negative side effects of, gut imbalance and things like that can go away. It's just something that's worth trying. There's a reason there's so much hype for it. And I think this paper is a wonderful way to show the powers of CBD.